Today's mindful moment, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. One deep dive at a time.
We hear it all the time, right? Endless economic growth. It's the answer. The foundation of a good society, progress, well-being. But what if that's not actually true? What if always wanting more is part of the problem?
Well, that's a great question to explore, and it's the perspective that David C. Korten takes in his book, When Corporations Rule the World, which you wanted to deep dive into.
Yeah, this book really stood out to me. And it's not just theory. He brings in so much from his own life, which is interesting. He even talks about a class he took at Stanford on revolutions. It sounds like it was a real eye-opener for him in terms of understanding just how much poverty there is in the world.
Right, and that academic experience kind of set the stage for a trip he took to Indonesia in 1961. He talks about witnessing a lot of poverty there, but also seeing these really deep spiritual traditions and generosity. It made him think differently about what progress really meant.
You mentioned his time at INCAE too, teaching in Latin America in the early 70s. It sounds like that was a big turning point for him.
It really was. He was teaching there and writing case studies about development projects. And he started noticing a pattern. The development programs that were kind of imposed from outside often ended up disrupting communities and actually making things worse for the people they were supposed to be helping. That he saw that when communities led their own development efforts, the results were way more positive and sustainable. This idea was reinforced through his work with family planning programs. He saw how the economic policies at the time actually hurt the poor.
So all these experiences led him to really start questioning the whole idea of development as it was being practiced.
Exactly. And it pushed him to think critically about the dominant economic system, what he calls real capitalism.
And he doesn't hold back, does he?
Not really. He sees this system as being built on this idea of individual selfishness, basically. A system designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a small elite.
I remember him using some pretty strong language to describe it, like a suicide economy, if I'm remembering that right.
Yeah, that's right. His point is that this focus on short-term profits and just getting more and more wealth ends up destroying the environment and communities that it depends on. It's self-destructive in the long run.
You know, it's a good example of that.
What are you thinking?
NAFTA. I mean, we all remember all the promises that were made when they were pushing for that trade agreement, right?
Yeah, definitely. More exports for the U.S., new American jobs, Mexican farmers getting richer, cleaner environment, Mexico's economy taking off, and less immigration. It was a long list.
But did any of that actually happen?
Well, you and I both read the reports from Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch and some other sources. And the reality is, it was a much different story. Mexico had to get rid of protections for their farmers. But American farmers still got tons of subsidies.
Right.
And the result? Mexico got flooded with cheap American corn. Prices for Mexican farmers dropped like crazy, something like 66%. A lot of those farmers went into debt, lost their land. And guess who took over? Huge foreign agribusinesses.
It's crazy how many farmers in Mexico lost their livelihoods. It was something like 1 million small farmers and another 1.5 million people working in agriculture lost their jobs between 1993 and 2005.
And it wasn't just in Mexico. American family farms suffered too. You know, NAFTA is a good illustration of this gap between how free trade agreements are supposed to work in theory and what actually happens to people in the real world.
It reminds me of that saying, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there is.
Exactly.
And this all ties into another big problem Korten talks about, growing inequality. I mean, the numbers he presents are pretty alarming when you think about it.
For sure. He shows how in the U.S. since 1940, there's been this trend. The bottom 90% of earners are getting a smaller and smaller share of the economic growth.
Right.
The exception was the 90s when things were a bit more even. But other than that, it's been a pretty clear pattern.
And the recovery after the 2008 crash made things even worse.
Right. From 2009 to 2012, the bottom 90% actually lost ground economically. Their slice of the pie shrunk. Meanwhile, the richest 1%, they took home something like 95% of all the gains. That's mind-boggling.
It really is. And this extreme concentration of wealth isn't just an American thing. It's happening globally. You know, the stats he gives are just wild. The richest 0.7% of people own almost half of all the wealth in the entire world, and the poorest, 70%. They only have 3%.
And that's where his distinction between phantom wealth and real wealth comes in. It helps to understand what's going on.
Okay, break that down for me. I think a lot of people get confused by those terms.
Well, think about it this way. Money, it's just a symbol, a tool for exchange. Its real value is in what you can buy with it. Actual goods and services,
Yeah.
food, housing, healthcare, the stuff we need to live.
Right.
But then you have things like stocks and real estate. Korten calls these phantom wealth assets. Their prices go up and down all the time based on market trends and speculation. They're not always connected to what's actually being produced or how well people are doing in the real economy.
So, like, when the stock market is booming, it doesn't mean that everyone suddenly got more job security or better housing.
Yeah, exactly. That's Korten's point. Celebrating growth in these phantom wealth assets can be a distraction from what's actually happening in the economy. And he even talks about how the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing might be inflating these bubbles even more.
He really makes you question how we measure wealth and success. Like, are we focused on the right things?
Right. He's saying that this obsession with money can blind us to what really matters. Quality of life, strong communities, are a healthy planet. And when we prioritize money above all else, we end up participating in what he calls a global suicide economy.
And he lays out how this system creates all these dependencies. Complicated global supply chains, reliance on harmful substances, and how it all gets reinforced through politics, the legal system, even our education system.
It's all connected.
This reminds me of another idea he talks about, the end of the open frontier. What do you think he means by that?
Well, back in the early days of industrialization, it seemed like there were unlimited resources,
Right.
land to exploit, new territories to expand into.
Right, like a safety valve.
Exactly. But that's not the world we live in anymore. Those frontiers are closed off. We're all competing for the same resources. And the problem is that wealthy countries like the US and Canada consume way more than their fair share.
It's not sustainable. I mean, studies have shown that our consumption levels here in the developed world are way beyond what the planet can handle. And that obviously has huge implications for poorer countries trying to meet their basic needs.
It does. And this ties into another important concept he brings up, the colonization of social economies.
This is a really interesting idea. Can you explain what he means by that?
Sure. So historically, there were all these activities that happened outside the money economy. Things people did within their families and communities without being paid for it. Neighbors helping each other, families taking care of their own members, bartering and trading goods and services locally. This was all part of the social economy.
I see. And these social economies were vital, weren't they?
Absolutely. They provided a safety net for people and helped build strong communities. But as the money economy expands, it pulls these activities into the market. People start getting paid for things they used to do for free out of a sense of community. And that can weaken those social bonds and make people more dependent on the market.
It's like we're losing something valuable in the process.
And of course, we can't talk about Korten's book without talking about corporate power. This is a central theme throughout. And he does a great job of tracing how this power has grown over time.
He even goes back to the British East India Company as an early example of this kind of corporate rule.
Right. And in the U.S., he talks about how corporations slowly gained influence over state legislatures. They were able to shape laws in their favor, limit their own liability, even secure their existence in perpetuity.
It's wild how corporations were able to accumulate so much power, often at the expense of individual rights and the well-being of communities.
And the legal system played a big role in this. There were court rulings that prioritized corporate property rights and interpreted the common good as just maximizing production. And then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you had the rise of these huge industrial trusts that further consolidated corporate power.
But things got a bit better for a while, right? After the Great Depression and World War II.
Yeah, there was a period of relative equality. But then starting in the 1970s, things started to shift back. There was this whole conservative political movement that pushed for deregulation, weaker unions, less government intervention in the economy.
And that really helped to tip the balance back towards corporations.
Exactly. And Korten argues that this resurgence was fueled by an ideology he calls corporate libertarianism. It's this almost religious belief in the free market. The idea that if corporations are just left to pursue their own self-interest, it'll somehow magically benefit everyone.
It's that whole trickle-down theory that we've heard so much about, but it seems like the benefits don't really trickle down very far, do they?
Not according to the evidence. Korten points out that this idea actually distorts how markets are supposed to work. Adam Smith, the guy who's often cited as the father of capitalism, he actually warned against concentrated economic power. He envisioned markets with lots of small businesses competing with each other, not these massive global corporations we have today.
And Korten sees economic globalization as a key part of this problem. He even calls it a form of new corporate colonialism.
He argues that globalization wasn't some inevitable force. It was a deliberate strategy by corporations to dismantle national economies and create this global system that benefits them. He quotes people like Akio Morita, the founder of Sony, who said that national borders are too small for modern business.
And George Ball, who was a big player in the American government, he said, we need free movement of all the things that go into making stuff, labor, capital, technology, everything.
Right, so we've gone from these multinational corporations that at least had some ties to specific countries to transnational corporations that don't really owe allegiance to anyone except their shareholders. Their bottom line is the only thing that matters.
I remember Korten using the example of BMW setting up a plant in South Carolina.
Yeah, that's a good illustration.
Yeah.
They went there not just for the cheap labor and low taxes, but also for things like the climate, the golf courses, the mansions, the lifestyle that the executives could enjoy.
It really shows how corporations are able to play different countries and regions off against each other.
Absolutely. And Korten talks about how this whole globalization project was carefully orchestrated by elite groups. Organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission.
These are the groups that meet behind closed doors and make decisions that affect all of us.
Right. They shape economic and monetary policies, often without any real democratic oversight. And Korten points out that the Council on Foreign Relations was already planning for a U.S.-dominated global economy back in the 1940s.
And then in the 1970s, when corporations were facing more scrutiny and regulation, they really ramped up their political activity.
Yeah, they started pushing hard for deregulation, globalization, and limits on government power. And they created all these front groups, these supposedly grassroots organizations that were actually funded by corporations to advance their agenda, like the Business Roundtable, for example. They're all about promoting globalization.
And of course, we can't forget about consumer culture. It plays a huge role in this whole system.
It really does. Korten argues that this culture of consumerism wasn't something that just happened naturally. It was carefully cultivated by retailers starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They shifted our values away from thrift and saving towards spending and indulgence.
It's all about making you feel like you need to buy more stuff to be happy.
Exactly. And global brands play a big role in this. The CEO of Coca-Cola, Roberto C. Goizueta, said that global brands connect people more than anything else.
And MTV is a perfect example of how this consumer culture gets spread around the world.
For sure. And Korten even points out how corporations are targeting kids directly with their marketing messages, even in schools.
So it's like we're being bombarded with this consumerist propaganda from all sides.
Right. Now let's talk about the role of these big international financial institutions. The World Bank, the IMF. How do they fit into all that?
Yeah, they seem to be key players in this whole global system.
Korten argues that they've actually made developing countries more dependent on the global economy. They provide loans, but with strings attached. And those strings often force countries to open up their markets to multinational corporations.
And he talks about the debt trap that a lot of these countries fall into. They borrow money from the World Bank and then end up owing so much that they can't even pay back the interest.
Exactly. And then in the late 1970s, when a lot of countries were facing debt crises, the World Bank and IMF stepped in as the saviors. But their solution was to impose these harsh conditions called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
And what did those SAPs do?
Well, they forced countries to privatize state-owned industries, deregulate their economies, and focus on exporting goods to earn foreign currency.
And that often led to cuts in public services, right? Like healthcare and education.
Exactly. And it made these countries even more vulnerable to the whims of the global market. And Korten points out that these loan negotiations often happened in secret with unelected officials. There was no real democratic accountability.
So it sounds like the World Bank and IMF were really pushing this free market ideology on developing countries.
Yeah, that's his argument. And then you have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which later became the World Trade Organization, the WTO. These organizations were supposed to be about promoting free trade, but Korten sees them as tools for expanding corporate power.
I remember reading about how transnational corporations had a lot of influence in those GATT negotiations.
Oh, yeah, they were definitely major players. And there were concerns even back then about whether these trade agreements were really serving the interests of ordinary people. Clayton Yutter, who was the U.S. Trade Representative under President George H.W. Bush, he even said that GATT could be used to override national laws on things like food safety.
Wow. So these international agreements could potentially undermine democratic decision-making at the national level.
That's right. And Korten then delves into the whole issue of money and finance, what he calls the money game.
It can feel like a game sometimes, can it? Like it's all just made up.
He traces how money has become increasingly detached from anything tangible.
Right.
We went from metal coins to paper money to this system where money is basically created out of thin air by banks.
Right.
And then you have asset values like stocks and real estate that are often based on speculation and market sentiment rather than any real underlying value.
It's like the financial markets are operating in a completely different reality from the rest of us.
Right. And this can lead to these huge bubbles and crashes that have devastating consequences for the real economy. The 1987 stock market crash, the 1995 Mexican peso crisis. These are just a few examples.
And Korten points out that not all investment is good investment. Some investors are just extractive. They're not creating new wealth. They're just siphoning off existing wealth.
Exactly. And then you have the whole world of derivatives, which are these complex financial instruments that can be really risky and hard to regulate. If you want to learn more about how the financial system works, there's a great YouTube channel called Mindful Moments that does AI-powered analyses of audiobooks. They might have something on finance that you'd find interesting.
I'll have to check that out. So it sounds like Korten sees the financial system as kind of a casino, right? Where people are gambling with money that doesn't even really exist.
That's a good way to put it. And this focus on short-term profits has led to what he calls corporate cannibalism.
That sounds ominous. What does he mean by that?
Well, corporations are under constant pressure to maximize profits for their shareholders, and this leads them to engage in all sorts of risky and destructive behavior. Mergers and acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, downsizing, outsourcing, all in the pursuit of quick profits.
Like that example he uses of Stride Rite, the shoe company. They moved their production overseas to take advantage of lower labor costs.
Right. And this race to the bottom has created a situation where companies that actually try to be responsible and sustainable are at a disadvantage. They can't compete with companies that are willing to exploit workers and pollute the environment.
And then there's the whole issue of automation. It's eliminating jobs at an alarming rate.
Korten argues that this wave of automation is different from previous ones. In the past, new industries emerged to absorb the workers who lost their jobs. But this time, it's not clear where those new jobs are going to come from. Even highly skilled workers are at risk of being replaced by machines.
He even suggests that eventually the owners of capital themselves might be displaced by fully automated corporations.
It's a scary thought. And even now, you see this growing anxiety among the elites about job security. Meanwhile, a huge percentage of full-time workers in the U.S. are earning poverty wages.
And Korten connects this to the Western model of development that he's been critiquing throughout the book. He argues that this model has disrupted traditional ways of life and made people dependent on wage labor and consumer goods.
He uses the example of Ladakh, a region in the Himalayas, where the introduction of a money-based economy actually led to more poverty and exploitation, even though the official economic indicators were showing growth.
So it's like the measures we're using to assess progress are flawed. They're not capturing the real human cost of this system.
Right. And Korten argues that this sense of displacement and exclusion is contributing to violence and social unrest around the world. He even suggests that we might be heading towards a breakdown of order where the state loses its monopoly on the use of force.
It's a pretty bleak picture, but he doesn't just leave us there, does he? He offers some solutions as well.
Right. He talks about the need for an ecological revolution, a fundamental shift in our understanding of the world and our place in it.
It sounds like he's calling for a kind of Copernican revolution in our thinking, moving away from this human-centered worldview to a more holistic one that recognizes the interconnectedness of all living things.
Exactly. He critiques this materialistic mindset that reduces everything to mere matter and energy. He says we need a new story, a new narrative that gives meaning to life beyond just consuming and accumulating stuff.
And he emphasizes the importance of social capital, the networks of trust and reciprocity that make communities strong.
Right. He cites Robert Putnam's research on how social capital is essential for effective governance. And he lays out some key principles for building what he calls a living Earth economy.
Can you summarize those principles for me?
Sure. So first, he says the economy should be subordinate to the civic and governmental sectors. It should serve the needs of people and the planet, not the other way around. And he emphasizes local ownership and control of resources, decentralized decision-making. He talks about subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the most local level possible.
Okay.
And he stresses the importance of internalizing costs, making sure that the price of goods and services reflects their true environmental and social impact. And he advocates for fair and balanced trade that benefits both parties.
He gives the example of the Union Square Farmers Market in New York City as a model for a localized sustainable food system.
Yeah, it's a great example of how we can create a more just and resilient food system. And he contrasts this with the current system of industrial agriculture, which is incredibly destructive to the environment and often exploitative of workers.
He also makes an important distinction between a job and a sustainable livelihood.
Right. A job is just a way to earn money. But a sustainable livelihood is about meeting your needs in a way that's good for your community and the planet.
And he talks about the power of civil society to bring about change. He gives examples of all these successful grassroots movements around the world.
From South Korea to Brazil to the Philippines, people are coming together to challenge corporate power and create a more just and sustainable world.
So it sounds like he's not against markets per se. He's just against markets that are dominated by giant corporations and driven by greed.
Exactly. He wants to see markets that are rule-based and operate within a framework of ethical values. And he stresses the importance of getting corporate money out of politics.
He talks about the need for campaign finance reform and other measures to restore democratic accountability.
And he proposes a whole range of policies to shift us towards a living Earth economy. Things like carbon taxes, fees on virgin materials, packaging fees, import tariffs to encourage local production.
And he advocates for reducing the work week and ensuring equal opportunities for everyone.
Right. It's a comprehensive vision for a truly sustainable and just future.
Finally, he talks about the need to reform international institutions. He says the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO are too powerful and need to be brought under democratic control.
He even proposes creating new UN agencies to counterbalance the power of those institutions. And a UN International Insolvency Court to help countries escape debt traps, a UN Office of Global Commons Assets to manage shared resources sustainably, a UN Agency for Living Earth Technologies to promote ecological innovation.
So he's calling for a pretty radical restructuring of the global economic system.
He is. He's arguing that we need to shift from this phantom wealth economics that's based on endless growth and speculation to a living Earth economics that's grounded in ecological principles and values like care sharing and responsibility.
It's a powerful vision, and it really challenges us to rethink our assumptions about progress and prosperity.
It does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with this question. Are the ways we're currently measuring progress actually making our lives better and creating a healthier planet? Or are we chasing a dangerous illusion?
That's something for all of us to think about. And if you found this deep dive insightful, please subscribe to our show for more explorations of critical ideas, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can also support our work and learn more about these issues by purchasing When Corporations Rule the World through the link in the show notes. But most importantly, take some time to reflect on these ideas and consider how they might apply to your own life and the choices you make.